She picked up her suitcase with both hands, walked through that ranch gate with her chin up and her heart hammering, and heard every single cowboy on that porch go quiet before the first one laughed out loud. She didn't stop walking. She didn't look back. She had nowhere else to go. If you've ever been counted out before anyone gave you a chance, stay with me, because this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels, and don't you dare leave before the end. Martha Collins had 47 cents in her coat pocket, a recipe book with a cracked spine, and the particular kind of quiet dignity that only comes from being told no so many times that yes starts to feel like a foreign language. She had walked into every kitchen, every boarding house, every ranch within 20 miles of Billings that had posted a cook's position, and she had watched the same thing happen every single time. They would open the door, take one long look at her, and something would shift in their faces. Not quite disgust, most of them were too polished for that, or at least too careful, but something adjacent to it. A narrowing of the eyes, a pulling back of the shoulders. And then the words would come, wrapped in whatever politeness they could manage. Position's been filled. Looking for someone with more experience. It's hard work, ma'am, physical work. That last one was her favorite. As though she had spent the last 12 years feeding logging camps and mining crews and families of 8 through 3 consecutive Montana winters by sitting in a rocking chair and hoping. Martha was 29 years old, and she was a large woman, not soft, not slow, but large in the way that made people in polished towns and respectable parlors decide they already knew everything they needed to know about her before she'd spoken a single word. She had her mother's broad shoulders and her father's stubborn jaw and hands that had earned every callus on them, and she had long since stopped apologizing for any of it. What she had not stopped doing was needing work. The morning she walked through the gate of Red Willow Ranch, she had been turned away from 4 other places in the span of 6 days. The last one had been a cattle operation outside of Roundup, where the rancher's wife had looked her up and down with a tight little smile and said, "I don't think you'd be comfortable out here, dear. It's very demanding." And Martha had thanked her, turned around, and walked back down the lane without letting her face change. Because she had learned that lesson early, you gave them nothing to feel superior about, not one slumped shoulder. Because they were already too eager to feel superior, and you didn't owe them the satisfaction. She had heard about Red Willow Ranch from a woman at the dry goods store in Billings, a broad, cheerful woman named Agnes who sold flour by the 50-pound sack and had no patience for what she called foolish people and their foolish opinions. Agnes had said the ranch was struggling, that they'd burned through 2 cooks in the past 3 months, that the foreman was desperate enough to hire almost anyone. Almost. Martha had noted that word but had chosen to walk through the gate anyway, because almost was better than the nothing she currently had. The lane leading up from the gate was long, and she felt the eyes on her before she was halfway up it. There were 6 or 7 men on and around the porch of the bunkhouse, doing the kind of idle things men do when they're between tasks, cleaning, tack, smoking. Leaning against posts in that particular loose-limbed way that suggested they had all the time in the world. They went quiet when they saw her coming, and then, exactly as she had expected, the whispering started. She could not make out words at that distance, but she knew the shape of that conversation. She had heard it enough times to know every beat of it. By the time she reached the porch steps, one of them young, with a sunburned nose and the kind of grin that had never been tested by anything serious, spoke up loud enough for everyone to hear. "Heck of a woman," he said, and the way he said it made it clear he did not mean it as a compliment. Martha stopped walking. She looked at him with the same expression she might use to examine a piece of questionable meat at a market stall, clinical, unhurried, faintly unimpressed. "You the foreman?" she asked. The young man blinked. "What? No, then sit back down," she said pleasantly, and walked up the porch steps past him. There was a moment of silence, and then a couple of the older men made sounds that might have been suppressed laughter, and the young man with the sunburned nose said something under his breath that she did not dignify by acknowledging. The man who came to the door was the foreman, she could tell immediately. He had the look of a man who had spent too many years managing other men's problems and not enough years sleeping. His name, she would learn later, was Roy Dempsey, and he had the kind of face that was constitutionally incapable of hiding what he was thinking. What he was thinking right now, looking at Martha on his porch with her suitcase and her recipe book and her frites and cents, was complicated. "Miss Collins," he said, which meant Agnes had at least sent word ahead. That's right. She didn't offer her hand because she'd learned men in this part of the country sometimes didn't know what to do with a woman's hand, and it only created awkwardness. "I understand you need a cook." Roy Dempsey looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly polite. "We do," he said slowly. "It's 20 ranch hands, 3 meals a day, plus whatever the supply situation gives us to work with, which lately has been paused." And she could see him deciding how much honesty to deploy. "Not ideal. I've cooked for larger," she said. "Mining camp outside of Butte, summer of '82. 38 men, 1 working stove, and a supply wagon that came every 2 weeks if the weather held." She watched his face. It usually didn't. Something shifted in Roy Dempsey's expression. Not warmth, not yet a kind of recalculation. "Last 2 cooks we had," he started. "Didn't stay," she finished for him. "I know, I'm not them." He looked at her again. She let him look. She was not going to fidget or look at the ground or do any of the things people seemed to expect when they studied her like a puzzle they were deciding wasn't worth solving. "Pays $12 a month," he said finally. "Room and board, which means a cot in the storage room off the kitchen until we get something better sorted. You'll start at 5 in the morning and you'll finish when the dishes are done." "Understood," she said. Roy Dempsey stepped back from the door and let her in. She heard one of the men on the porch say, low enough that he thought she couldn't hear, "How long you reckon she lasts?" And she heard someone else summon with a different kind of voice, quieter and older, and with something careful in it say, "Longer than you think." She did not turn around to see who had said it. The kitchen at Red Willow Ranch was the saddest room she had ever cooked in, and Martha had cooked in some genuinely sorrowful rooms. She stood in the doorway and did what she always did first. She looked at everything without touching anything, letting the picture form. The stove had a warped door on the lower oven. She could see it wasn't seating flush from where she stood. There were shelves along the back wall with gaps where supplies should have been, and what was there had been organized with the particular chaos of someone who'd been putting things away in a hurry for months and never gone back to fix it. There were 3 large pots, one with a handle that had been repaired with wire repair that would hold for perhaps another 2 weeks before it became a hazard. There was a scarred wooden work table in the center of the room, big enough, and a cutting board that needed to be scrubbed down with salt and lemon before she'd feel right using it. A window on the east wall let in decent morning light. The floor was swept at least. Roy had left her to it. She set her suitcase in the corner and her recipe book on the table, not to use, necessarily, because she held most of her recipes in her head by now, but because she liked having it there. Liked the weight and familiarity of it, and she started from the beginning. She opened every cabinet. She counted every supply, every measure of flour, every piece of salt pork, every tin of beans. She found a crate of potatoes behind the back door that had been allowed to sit long enough that a third of them were going soft. She set aside the ones that were still good and she thought about what she could do with the ones that weren't. Potato mash was off the table, but a base for soup stock wasn't, not yet. She noted that someone had been buying provisions without a plan, just grabbing what was available rather than thinking 2 or 3 weeks ahead, and that was the kind of waste that ground a household down slowly. Until one day you looked at the account books and couldn't understand where everything had gone. She rolled up her sleeves and started dinner. It was 2 hours later, when she was halfway through a pot of beef stew that smelled better than anything that kitchen had likely produced in months, that she heard the door and looked up. She had expected Roy Dempsey, or possibly the young man with the sunburned nose, coming to make some other joke he thought was clever. The man who came through the door was neither. He was somewhere in his early to mid-30s, lean and weathered in the way that men who worked outdoors and meant it got weathered, with a quiet face and steady eyes, and the kind of posture that said he was comfortable in his own skin without needing to announce it. He was carrying a crate, a heavy one. She could tell by the way his arms were taking the weight, and he set it down on the end of the work table with the care of someone who'd been taught not to bang things around in other people's workspaces. "Roy said you might be needing these," he said. "Supply wagon came in this afternoon. I brought the dry goods first." Martha looked at the crate, then at him. "Thank you," she said, and meant it straightforwardly, the way she meant most things. He nodded, and he did not look at her the way the men on the porch had looked at her. He looked at the stove, then at the pot, and something crossed his face, just a flicker that she might, if she were being generous, have called appreciation. "Smells like something's actually going to be edible tonight," he said. "Generally the goal," she said. One corner of his mouth moved. She would not call it a smile yet. It was more preliminary than that, more exploratory. "I'm Caleb," he said. "Martha Collins," she said. "I'm the new cook." "I figured," he said, without anything pointed in it. Just an observation. He went back out and came back with another crate and then another after that. He stacked them neatly. She noticed that the neatness of it, the deliberateness, and when he was done he stood for a moment, as though deciding something. "That oven door," he said, nodding toward the stove. "It's been like that since March. I can fix it. Probably take me 20 minutes if you can spare the stove for a bit." Martha looked at the stove door, then at him.
"You know stoves."
"I know that one," he said, "and I've got the time." She stepped back and let him at it. He pulled a small set of tools from his vest pocket, and she noted with interest that a man who carried tools in his vest pocket was a man who expected to be needed for practical things throughout the course of his day, and he got down to it without ceremony. She stirred her stew and watched him work, not because she was particularly interested in oven repair, but because watching how a person worked told you a great deal about them. He was careful, methodical. He didn't force anything. When something didn't go quite right, he stopped and thought about it rather than pushing through, and she had always found that to be a good sign in a person, the willingness to stop and reconsider rather than stubbornly muscle forward. "You been here long?" she asked. He said. "Roy says they've had trouble keeping a cook on." He was quiet for a moment. "Ranch has had some trouble overall," he said. "Kitchen's part of it. Men can't work properly if they're not eating properly." "No," she agreed. "They can't." He looked up at her briefly, and there it was again, that thing in his eyes that she couldn't quite categorize yet, that attention that didn't feel like judgment. "Where'd you cook before this?" he asked. She told him the mining camp, the 2 years running a kitchen at a boarding house in Helena, the family she'd worked for before that, out in the Gallatin Valley. She told it straightforwardly, without decoration, because she had found that the truth of her experience was always more convincing than any embellishment she might have added. He listened with a kind of attention that was actually somewhat unusual. Men, especially men who worked with their hands, who were accustomed to being heard without having to try, often listened to women the way they listened to weather, aware that something was being communicated, but not particularly interested in the specific content. This man was doing something different. He was listening, like what she said was information he intended to retain. "You left Helena voluntarily?" he asked. "The boarding house changed hands," she said. New owner had a cousin who needed work. He made a small sound that contained, she thought, exactly the right amount of comment without actually making one. He got the oven door seated properly. She could hear the difference immediately when he swung it shut, that solid click of a seal that meant heat would distribute the way it was supposed to. He cleaned up after himself, which she also noted. The kitchen floor was no worse for his presence than it had been before he arrived. "Thank you," she said again, and this time he did smile briefly, genuinely, without performing it. "Good luck tonight," he said. "First meal matters." She knew that. Dinner that first evening was beef stew with biscuits and a dried apple cobbler that she'd cooked together with the last of the apples from a barrel that had been sitting in the corner, ignored. She had seasoned it properly, not lavishly, because lavish seasoning required lavish supplies, but properly, which in her experience was the thing that most men noticed without knowing they were noticing it. Food that tasted like something. Food that tasted like someone had been paying attention. She served it herself, which surprised some of the hands. She wasn't required to. Roy had indicated that they usually collected their own plates, but she wanted to see their faces when they ate, wanted to read the room the way she always read any new situation she walked into, directly and without flinching. The young man with the sunburned nose, she had learned his name was Pete Hartley, was the loudest in his surprise, which she found predictable. He took a first bite, and his expression went through several quick revisions, and he said, "Well, huh," in a tone that was not the warmest she'd ever received, but was, she judged, sincere. An older hand named Frank Greer, who had a gray mustache and the air of a man who had been disappointed by too many things to be easily impressed, ate half his plate before he said anything. When he spoke, it was to Roy, sitting at the other end of the table, and he said, "Where'd you find her?" "Agnes Whitfield sent her over," Roy said. Frank Greer nodded and went back to eating. That was his entire review, and Martha found it entirely satisfactory. She had positioned herself so that she could see the full length of the table, and she noticed she was always noticing things. It was perhaps her most useful quality, that Caleb sat at the far end, slightly apart from the main cluster of men. Not isolated, not excluded, but separate in a way that felt chosen rather than imposed. He ate without looking up much, and once, when Pete Hartley made another joke that she didn't quite catch but that got a few laughs, Caleb didn't laugh. He just continued eating with a quietness that she was beginning to understand had nothing to do with shyness. After dinner, when the hands had cleared out and she was washing up, he came back through the kitchen with an empty water bucket, heading for the pump, and he paused at the door. "Good meal," he said. "Thank you," she said. "They'll be respectful from here," he said. She looked up from the pot she was scrubbing. "Will they?" It wasn't quite a question. He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said simply, as though he knew something she didn't. She might have asked him what made him so certain. But he had already gone through the door, and she had 3 more pots to scrub, and she filed it away the same place she filed everything she didn't yet understand, in the back of her mind, where things sat and developed in the dark until they were ready to be examined. The next 2 weeks were the kind of work that Martha understood and respected and was, in truth, glad of. The plain, demand, unglamorous work of transforming a broken system into one that functioned. She reorganized the supply cabinet from the ground up, labeling and rotating stock with the rigor of someone who had watched too many kitchens fail because of disorganization rather than lack of resources. She created a rotation menu that allowed her to use the cheapest, most abundant ingredients in enough variations that the hands didn't feel like they were eating the same thing every day, because men who felt like they were eating the same thing every day got irritable in ways that made Roy Dempsey's life more difficult, and Roy Dempsey was the only person on the property who had actually treated her fairly from the moment she'd arrived, so she felt some loyalty to making his life manageable. She fixed the cutting board. She persuaded Roy to replace the pot with the wired handle before someone got burned. She started keeping a list of what they were running low on and brought it to Roy every Thursday, which meant the supply orders started being placed with actual planning behind them rather than guesswork. She fed those 20 men every day, 3 times a day, and she did it well. The mockery did not stop entirely. Pete Hartley was the kind of young man who needed a few more years and a few more hard experiences before he would grow into actual decency, and he was not alone in his type, but it quieted. It became more peripheral. The hands who had been loudest in their skepticism started showing up to meals on time, rather than wandering in at their leisure, which was the kind of respect that didn't announce itself but was, in Martha's experience, more reliable than the kind that did. Caleb continued to be the quietest presence in the room and somehow the most consistent one. He had gotten into the habit. She was not sure when it started exactly, or whether he was aware of it as a habit or simply doing it, because the occasion arose of stopping by the kitchen for 20 minutes or so in the late afternoon, the slow hour between the end of the day's main work and supper preparation. Sometimes he brought things: a bag of cornmeal, a block of lard, once a wild turkey that one of the hands had brought down and that he had already cleaned and dressed, which told her he'd done it himself rather than dumping the raw bird on her table. Sometimes he just sat on the stool near the back door while she worked, and they talked. They talked about all kinds of things. They talked about ranch logistics. She asked questions and he answered them. And she understood early on that he had answers for everything, that there was no corner of this ranch's operation he was not familiar with, which for a working hand struck her as unusual, but which she set aside to think about later. They talked about the territory, about what the winters were like, and what the summers got to, and whether the creek that ran along the north edge of the property was reliable or had dry years. They talked about food, which Martha could discuss with the same fluency other people used for politics or scripture, and which Caleb seemed to find genuinely interesting rather than politely tolerating. He told her once, offhandedly, that his mother had been a cook, not professionally but in the way that ranch women were cooks, comprehensively and without option, and that he had learned early that the person who fed people was the person who understood what they needed before they knew it themselves. Martha had looked at him when he said that, and thought, "You know more than you're letting on." But she did not say it. There was a morning in the third week when she was in the middle of bread dough elbow deep, the way bread required the rhythmic push and fold, that she found oddly meditative, when two of the younger hands came into the kitchen for something. She registered them without looking up, the way she registered most background presences in the kitchen, and for a moment they talked around her as though she weren't there. "Can't believe Roy actually kept her on," one of them said. She thought it was a boy named Colin, who had not been among the worst of them, but had not been among the best either. "Big as she is," the other one said. "I figured she'd be gone inside a week." Figured she couldn't keep up. Martha continued working the dough. Push and fold. Push and fold. "Keeps up fine," Colin said, with the air of someone who had been surprised into an opinion he hadn't planned on having. "Better than the last two. You eat that cobbler last night?" "Yeah, tell me that woman can't cook." The other one was quiet. "I'm just saying," Colin continued, dropping his voice in a way that suggested he thought this was private, which it was not. "It ain't what I expected." Martha picked up her dough ball, turned it, set it back down, and kept working. She did not say anything. She didn't need to. She had learned a long time ago that proving yourself with consistency was more permanent than proving yourself with confrontation, and she was in this kitchen for the long haul. The door opened behind the two boys, and she heard the particular quality of silence that descended when someone else entered, the slightly straighter posture, the way their conversation cut off mid-sentence. "Didn't Roy need those fence posts moved up to the north pasture this morning?" Caleb's voice said. She heard the boys leave with impressive speed. She kept her eyes on her dough, but she could feel him come to stand near the end of the table, not crowding her workspace, never crowding her workspace. He had a natural sense of other people's working radius that she appreciated, and she could feel him looking at her in that careful, attentive way. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I can handle Pete Hartley and whoever that was." "I know that too," he said. They needed to be somewhere else. That's all. She looked up then, because something in his voice warranted looking up. He was watching her with an expression she still hadn't entirely catalogued, something that held a weight to it, a kind of patient seriousness, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "What do you actually do on this ranch?" she asked him. He didn't look away. "Whatever needs doing," he said. "That's not an answer." "It's the truest one I've got right now," he said. And there was something in that right now that she filed away, that went into the back of the mind cabinet with everything else she hadn't resolved yet. She went back to her bread dough. He stayed a while longer, and they talked about the weather coming in from the north and whether she thought the supply order Roy had placed would make it through before the rain hit. And when he left, she thought about the way he'd said right now. And she thought about the way he knew everything about this land. Every fence line and water source and weak point in the operation. The way he moved through this ranch with a familiarity that went deeper than the familiarity of a hired hand who'd been here a while. She thought about it for a long time, and she started paying attention to the things she hadn't thought to pay attention to before, the way Roy Dempsey sometimes asked Caleb's opinion on things that a foreman wouldn't normally run by a working hand. The way certain decisions, small ones and large ones alike, seemed to pause in a funny way until Caleb weighed in. The way the older hands, men who'd been in this business long enough to know the difference between authority and the performance of authority, treated Caleb with a deference they did not extend to each other. She was not a woman who arrived at conclusions before she had the evidence for them. That had always been one of her better qualities. She thought the willingness to sit with uncertainty until the picture became clear, rather than rushing to fill it in with whatever was available. But the picture was beginning to develop slowly in that back-of-the-mind cabinet of hers. And whatever it was, she was not yet sure whether she was ready to see it. The trouble started at the end of her third week, which in her experience was about the right time for trouble to start, long enough after her arrival that she understood the place, not so long that the place was entirely settled into her presence. It came in the form of a man named Gerald Hatch, who arrived at Red Willow on a Thursday morning with two well-dressed men she didn't recognize and a smile that she distrusted immediately. She didn't meet him. She was in the kitchen, but she heard the conversation through the open window, the way sound carried on a dry summer morning, and what she heard made her set down her knife and listen with the full, sharp attention she brought to things that mattered. Gerald Hatch was talking about water rights. He was talking about the creek along the north edge of the property, the same creek she had asked Caleb about, the one he'd told her had dry years, and he was talking about it in the specific, cheerful way of a man who was explaining why something belonged to him that the other party had not yet realized didn't belong to them anymore. She heard Roy Dempsey's voice, stiff with a controlled anger that she had not heard from him before. "Those water rights have been part of this ranch for 15 years, Mr. Hatch." "Well," Gerald Hatch said pleasantly, "that's what we're here to discuss." She picked her knife back up. She continued her work. But she was thinking, with that particular cold clarity that came to her when something important was happening and she needed to understand it. She was thinking about everything she had learned about this ranch in 3 weeks, about the supply patterns and the land layout, and the way the cattle moved through the summer grazing rotation, and what would happen to 20 men and a herd of cattle if the water source along the north edge of the property became suddenly unavailable or suddenly very expensive. And she was thinking about Caleb, who knew everything about this ranch, who had said whatever needs doing with a quietness that contained more than she had yet understood. She was thinking that it was time to start asking different questions. Gerald Hatch came back on Friday. Martha knew it before she heard the horses, the way she always knew when something bad was cycling back around, a tightening in the air, a change in how the men moved through the yard. Roy Dempsey had been short-tempered all morning, answering her questions about the supply order in clipped half-sentences, which was not like him. Frank Greer had come in for his second cup of coffee without saying a word, which was also not like him. And Pete Hartley, who normally had something loud to say about everything, had been quiet since breakfast in the way that young men got quiet when they understood something serious was happening, but didn't know what to do about it. Martha stacked the breakfast plates and listened. The conversation happened on the porch of the main house, far enough that she couldn't make out every word, close enough that she caught the shape of it. Hatch's voice was smooth and patient, the voice of a man who had practiced making bad news sound like good news until he couldn't tell the difference himself. Roy's voice stayed flat and controlled. She did not hear Caleb's voice at all, which struck her as strange because Caleb was always somewhere nearby in the mornings, always appearing in the kitchen or crock-sowing the yard or coming in from the north pasture right around the time the work shifted from early tasks to the main business of the day. She went to the kitchen window. Caleb was standing at the far end of the porch, arms crossed, watching the conversation between Roy and Hatch with the particular stillness of a man who was working very hard at not saying something. One of Hatch's companions, a lean man with a city suit and a leather satchel full of papers, kept glancing at Caleb in the nervous sideways way that people glanced at things they weren't sure were dangerous. Martha noted that. She went back to her work. But the gears in her mind were already turning, and they did not stop. After Hatch left, she found Caleb at the pump, washing his hands with the kind of deliberateness that meant he was using the action to give himself time to think. She came out with the empty water bucket because the water bucket did need filling and because it gave her a reason to be there that required no explanation. She waited until she was at the pump beside him. "What does Hatch want?" she asked. He looked at her sideways. "Roy talked to you, nobody talked to me," she said. "I have a window and ears and 20 years of understanding when something's wrong." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's claiming the North Creek boundaries were misdrawn when the original deed was filed. Says the water rights attached to the creek belong to his property, not this one." Martha set her bucket under the pump. "Does he have paperwork?" "He has something that looks like paperwork," Caleb said, with a flatness in his voice that contained a considerable amount of controlled anger. "Whether it's legitimate is another question. Who would know the answer to that question?" He looked at her directly now. "A land office clerk. Or a lawyer. Or someone who'd read the original filings and could compare them." "Has Roy seen the original deed?" A pause. "Roy manages the day-to-day." She looked at him. "That's not what I asked." He dried his hands on the rag he kept in his back pocket slowly, and she could see him deciding something. She could always see when he was deciding something. There was a quality of stillness to him that deepened right before he made a choice. "The original deed is in the house," he said. "Main office." "Then somebody needs to read it," she said, "and compare it to whatever Hatch brought." "Martha, I'm not saying I need to do it," she said, turning back to the pump handle. "I'm saying somebody does, before he comes back a third time with more paperwork and more patience than you've got." She filled her bucket and carried it back to the kitchen, and she did not look back to see his expression, but she could feel it, the way you could feel weather changing. It was 2 days later that Roy Dempsey came to the kitchen door while she was in the middle of the noon meal and stood there for a moment with his hat in his hands. A man preparing to ask for something he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. "Miss Collins," he said. "Sit down, Roy," she said without turning from the stove. He sat. She finished ladling the soup, set the pot off the heat, wiped her hands, and turned to look at him. He had the expression of a man who hadn't slept well in several nights, which she had noticed but not addressed, because it wasn't her business until someone made it her business. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know you can say no." "Ask," she said. "I know you keep records," he said. "Supply records, meal logs. The organization you set up in the kitchen." He paused. "Can you read a land deed?" Martha pulled the other stool out from under the table and sat down across from him. "What kind of shape is it in, old?" he said. 1870 filing. Some of the language he stopped, legal language. "I can read it, but I don't know if I'm reading it right." "And Hatch's papers?" Roy's jaw tightened. "He's claiming a boundary amendment was filed in 78. I can't find any record of it here, but he's got a document that looks official enough that I don't know what to say when he waves it at me." Martha looked at him steadily. "Who else has seen it?" "Hatch's document." "And Caleb? What did Caleb say?" Roy was quiet for a moment. He said it looked like it had been written by someone who knew what a legal document should look like. Martha understood what that meant. "Show me both," she said. She spent that evening at the table in the ranch office, a room she had not been in before. A room that smelled of old paper and leather and the particular dusty weight of documents that had been important for a long time, with the original deed from 1870, Hatch's claimed amendment from 1878, a lamp turned up as high as it would go, and the focused, unhurried attention that had always been her strongest tool. Roy had given her the documents and then made himself scarce, which she appreciated. She didn't need an audience for this kind of work. She read the original deed twice, slowly, making notes on a piece of paper with the stub of a pencil she'd found in the desk drawer. The language was dense and old-fashioned but not incomprehensible. She had read enough contracts and agreements in her years of managing other people's households to understand the structure of legal language. The way it stacked qualifications and conditions, the way it defined boundaries with the kind of specificity that became ambiguous only if you looked at it from the wrong angle. The boundary of the North Water easement, as described in the original deed, ran along the eastern bank of the creek at a point defined by reference to a granite outcropping and a particular bend in the watercourse. She read that 3 times, eastern bank. The easement and therefore the water rights were attached to everything on the eastern bank, which was Red Willow's land. Then she read Hatch's amendment document. She read it once. Then she read it again. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The amendment claimed that a survey correction in 1878 had redefined the boundary point, moving it to the western bank of the creek. It was dated, stamped, and signed by someone claiming to be a deputy clerk of the Territorial Land Office. The problem was the signature. She pulled the original deed back and looked at the witness signatures, at the bottom 3 names, including one that was identified as the Territorial Land Office clerk for that district in 1870. She compared the handwriting of that name with the signature on Hatch's amendment, which purported to be from the same office 8 years later. She was not a handwriting expert. She was a ranch cook from Billings, Montana Territory, with 47 cents in a cracked recipe book. But she had spent 12 years managing supply lists and household accounts, which meant she had spent 12 years comparing written records and identifying when something had been altered or recorded inconsistently. And what she was looking at now had the quality of a document that had been made to look like something, rather than a document that was something. The formatting was slightly off. The stamp was positioned differently than any official stamp she'd seen on territorial documents, and she had seen several in the course of managing land transactions for the family she'd worked for in the Gallatin Valley. The date notation used a format that she was fairly certain the territorial office had changed before 1878. She sat with that for a long moment, because she was not the kind of person who said things until she was sure, and she was not entirely sure. But she was close. She was folding the documents back into order when the door opened and Caleb came in. She had not heard him coming. He moved quietly. She had noticed that from the start, the way some men did who had learned that arriving unannounced told you more about a situation than announcing yourself did. He stopped when he saw her at the desk. "Roy said you were in here," he said. Roy was right, she said. He came the rest of the way into the room and stood across the desk from her, looking at the documents in her hands with an expression she couldn't entirely read in the lamplight. "Find anything?" "Maybe," she said. She put the documents on the desk between them, and she pointed to the amendment. "This stamp. What do you know about how Territorial Land Office documents were stamped?" He looked at it. Really not a glance. Not a dismissal, but the same quality of attention he gave everything. Slow and thorough. "The office moved in 76, he said. Changed their stamp when they moved. This one looks like the pre-move stamp." Martha looked at him. "How do you know that?" He met her eyes across the desk, and there was a moment, a long one, where she could see him right at the edge of something, right at the place where a decision was waiting. "I've seen a lot of land office documents," he said carefully. "Caleb." She kept her voice even. He did not look away. "Right now I'm someone trying to figure out if Gerald Hatch forged a territorial document," he said. "Can we work with that?" She held his gaze for another 3 seconds. Then she looked back at the papers. "The date format is wrong too," she said. "The territorial office switched to a different notation standard before 78. This document uses the old format." He leaned forward and looked at the date line. "You're right," he said. And there was something in his voice, something quieter than usual, something that sounded almost like relief, or like awe. She couldn't decide which. "We need someone who can officially verify it," she said. "Someone from the land office, or a lawyer with access to the original filing records. What Roy has isn't going to be enough when Hatch comes back." "Hatch is coming back Wednesday," Caleb said, "with a judge." The air in the room went still. "A judge," she repeated. "Judge Harmon. Out of Billings. Hatch has been building this case for months." He wants a ruling on the water rights, and if he gets one before we can challenge the amendment, the creek is his. Martha set her pencil down on the desk. Her mind was moving fast, not panicking, not catastrophizing, but running through the problem the way she ran through a kitchen crisis. Fast and systematic, identifying what she had, what she needed, and what was possible in the time available. What's today, Sunday? That's 3 days, she said. 3 days, he confirmed. She stood up from the desk. Then we need to stop talking about what Hatch has and start working on what we can show to contradict it. The original deed is solid. These inconsistencies in the amendment are real. We need the filing records from the land office to prove the amendment doesn't appear in them. She looked at him. Who can get to Billings and back before Wednesday? He was already moving toward the door. I'll go tomorrow, he said. Take the documents, she said, the amendment. Make a copy of the relevant sections of the original deed first. Roy should have a copy here anyway, and it shouldn't leave the property. He stopped at the door and turned back. The lamp caught his face, and she could see something in it that hadn't been visible before. Not just that careful, patient attention she'd come to know, but something underneath it. Something that looked like a man who had not expected to be surprised by anyone and had been surprised. You found this in one evening, he said. I was looking for it, she said. That's all. Roy's been looking at those documents for 3 days. Roy was looking for reasons it couldn't be right, she said. I was looking for reasons it was wrong. Those are different things. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said Martha. Something in the way he said her name made her stop putting papers in order. Thank you, he said. It was not a complicated thing, 2 words, nothing extravagant, but there was a weight behind it that made it more than what it said, a weight she felt but did not yet examine. Go to Billings, she said. We can be grateful later. He went. She was up at 4:30 the next morning, earlier than usual, because the anxiety that came with a problem she couldn't yet solve had worked its way into her sleep and left her restless. She had the coffee on, and the first bread proving before 5, and she had gone over her notes from the previous evening twice more in her head, looking for any angle she'd missed, any conclusion she'd drawn too fast. She had not drawn any conclusions too fast. She was rarely wrong when she'd been this careful. But rarely and never were different words, and she felt the difference. Pete Hartley came in early for coffee, which he'd been doing more often lately, she'd noticed, without remarking on it. That the young man who'd been loudest on the day she arrived had developed the habit of appearing in the kitchen a little before the others in the morning. He didn't say much. Sometimes he sat on the stool by the back door and just drank his coffee and watched her work, which she thought might have been his version of an apology present without having to say so. This morning he sat down and said, Hatch really trying to take the creek? Martha continued shaping her loaves. Where'd you hear that? Frank told me. Frank heard Roy and Caleb talking last night. He wrapped both hands around his mug. Can he do it if we have anything to say about it? Martha said. Pete was quiet. Then what can you do about it? You're the cook. He didn't mean it the way he would have meant it 3 weeks ago. She could hear the differenceless contempt, more genuine puzzlement. He was actually asking. I'm a person who pays attention, she said. Same as anyone else. He thought about that. You think Hatch is cheating? I think his document has problems, she said carefully. Think Caleb's gone to Billings to verify that. Pete nodded slowly. He looked older than he had on the day she'd arrived. Not by much, but something had shifted, some small recalibration. This ranch goes under, he said quietly. I don't know where I go. Been here 3 years. Martha set her shaped loaves in their pans and covered them. Then help, she said. How? When Hatch comes Wednesday with his judge, she said every man on this property who cares whether Red Willow stays standing needs to be present and accounted for. Not rowdy, not threatening, just present. You understand the difference? He thought about it. Like witnesses, exactly like witnesses, she said. He finished his coffee and set the mug down on the table, and he stood up with the particular purposefulness of a young man who had just been given something he could actually do. I'll tell the others, he said. Tell Frank first, she said. He'll say it the right way. Pete nodded, and she thought she might have seen, just at the edge of it, the beginning of the man he might become with a few more seasons on him. Caleb came back Tuesday evening, later than she'd expected, and she heard his horse in the yard from the kitchen and stayed where she was because she had learned that some things needed to arrive on their own schedule. He came through the kitchen door 20 minutes later with trail dust on his coat and something in his expression that made her look up from the pie she was finishing. The amendment isn't in the filing records, he said. I talked to the head clerk. She went back through every filing from 76 to 80. The amendment hatches does not appear. Martha set her pie aside. She'll say that to a judge? She'll send a written statement, he said. And she's willing to appear if it comes to a formal proceeding, he paused. She also said she recognized the style of the stamp. Said it's a copy of a stamp that went missing from the auxiliary office in '79. Martha stared at him. He stole a stamp. Or had access to someone who did, Caleb said. Which means this isn't improvised. He's been planning this for a while. The kitchen went very quiet. How many other ranches do you think he's done this to? She asked. Caleb's jaw tightened. I intend to find out. But first we get through Wednesday. She looked at him, at the tiredness in his face, the 2 days of trail on him, the way he was holding himself with the controlled steadiness of a man running on will rather than rest, and she said, Sit down. I'll make you something. He blinked as though the ordinariness of it surprised him. Then he sat down. She sliced bread and put leftover stew on the stove to warm, and she poured him coffee. And she listened while he told her the rest of what he'd found, the conversations at the land office, the clerk's records. The fact that 2 other properties north of Red Willow had settled water disputes with Hatch in the past 18 months, settlements that the clerk had found notable for how quickly they'd been resolved. He's done it before, Martha said. At least twice that I can document, Caleb said. Maybe more. Can we bring that into Wednesday's proceeding? Judge Harmon is a circuit judge, Caleb said. He'll hear what's in front of him. The other properties are a separate matter. But if we can show him the amendment is fraudulent, the rest follows. Martha sat down across from him while the stew heated. Roy knows all this? Roy knows some of it. I'll tell him the rest tonight. He needs to hear it before tomorrow, she said. He needs to sleep on it and come into Wednesday steady. Roy's a good man, but he gets rattled when things surprise him. Caleb looked at her across the table with that expression she kept failing to fully categorize. You've known him 3 weeks, he said. I watch people, she said simply. The stew came to temperature, and she ladled it out, and they sat in the kitchen in the late-night quiet with the lamp turned low and the rest of the ranch asleep around them. And she thought not for the first time that this was a strange thing. This particular quality of ease that existed between them, this feeling of 2 people who had known each other for different lengths of time, depending on which measure you used. You should sleep, she said when his bowl was empty. In a while, he said. He looked at her. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said carefully, the work we've done is solid. The clerk's statement is solid. You've done what could be done in the time available. We, he said. What? We've done what could be done, he said. Not me. You found the inconsistencies in the document. You knew what questions to ask. If you hadn't been in that office Sunday evening, he stopped. You would have found it, she said. Maybe, he said. Not by Wednesday. She picked up his empty bowl and her own and carried them to the wash basin. She could feel him watching her, that careful attention that had been one of the first things she'd noticed about him, and she was acutely aware as she stood with her back to Tim, washing bowls in a quiet kitchen at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night with a legal confrontation 16 hours away, that she had not been this aware of being in a room with someone in a very long time. Get some sleep, Caleb, she said. He stood up. She heard the stool scrape, heard him cross to the door. Heard him pause. Martha, he said. She did not turn around. Good night, she said, a silence. Then good night, he said, and went out. She finished the dishes and dried her hands and stood in the quiet kitchen for a long moment before she extinguished the lamp. She thought about document stamps and water rights, and the particular quality of a man's voice when he said a woman's name like it meant something to him that he hadn't yet found the right words for. She thought about 3 weeks of mornings and afternoons and late evenings, and the way a person could come to feel like part of a place without anyone formally saying so, and the way that feeling was different from all the other places she had been. She put the lamp out. Wednesday was coming. And Martha Collins, who had walked through that gate with 47 cents and a cracked recipe book and a dignity that nobody on this ranch had had the sense to recognize on sight, Martha Collins was going to be ready for it. Wednesday came in hard and fast, the way trouble always did when you'd had just enough time to prepare for it, but not quite enough time to feel ready. Martha was up before 4. She had the coffee on, the bread started, and the breakfast moving before a single hand had stirred in the bunkhouse, and she was doing it the way she did everything, when her mind was working on something else, on the surface efficient and unhurried. Underneath, running through every angle, every possibility, every gap in what they had. Roy had come to find her the night before after Caleb finished telling him everything, and he had stood in her kitchen doorway with the look of a man who had just understood the full size of the thing that was coming at him. She had made him sit down. She had given him coffee, and she had gone through it with him, the same way she'd gone through it with Caleb, methodical. No catastrophizing and no false comfort either. Just the facts as they stood and what the facts could do for them. He forged it, Roy had said, not a question. Just a man landing on a truth that had too many consequences attached to it to absorb all at once. The clerk's statement says the amendment doesn't exist in the filing records, Martha had said. The stamp matches one that was reported missing. That's not proof of forgery in a courtroom, not by itself. But it's enough to throw serious doubt on Hatch's document, and doubt is what we need today. What if the judge sides with him anyway? Then we challenge it formally and we have the clerk appear in person, she had said. But Harmon is a circuit judge, not a corrupt one. He has a reputation to protect across every county he rides. He's not going to attach his name to a fraudulent water claim in front of witnesses if we give him a reason to look more carefully. Roy had nodded slowly. Then he'd said, Miss Collins, I want you to know whatever happens today, this ranch is better than it was a month ago. Because of you. She had thanked him and sent him to bed, and she had stood in the kitchen afterward and felt the particular weight of that kind of acknowledgement. The kind that wasn't flattery, just a tired man telling the truth. Now it was Wednesday morning, and the yard outside her kitchen window was still dark, and she had 4 hours before Hatch and his judge arrived, and she intended to use every minute of them. Frank Greer was the first one in for breakfast, as he usually was. He poured his own coffee and sat at the end of the table and looked at her with the expression she had come to read as his version of asking. Caleb and Roy are ready, she said, answering the question he hadn't put words to. Drank his coffee. Then that boy Caleb. He's something more than a ranch hand, ain't he? Martha turned back to the stove. What makes you say that? 20 years of watching men, Frank said. You know the difference between a man who works land and a man who owns it. Something about the way they stand on it. He paused. I never said anything because it wasn't my business. But today feels like a day when things stop being what they appear to be. Martha was quiet for a moment. Whatever he is, she said, he came back from Billings with what we needed. That's what matters today. Frank looked at her with those old, measured eyes. You found the problem in the document, he said, not him. We found it, she said firmly, between us. He made that sound again, the almost not quite it sound. That was Frank Greer's version of saying she was right. The hands came in for breakfast in 2s and 3s, and she could feel the different quality in the room. The quietness that wasn't comfortable but wasn't panic either. The kind of collective steadiness that groups of men developed when they understood that something important was about to happen, and that how they conducted themselves in it would matter. Pete Hartley came in and sat down without making a single joke, which was, she had come to understand, the loudest possible signal that he was taking something seriously. She had made a full breakfast, bigger than usual. She had done it deliberately, not because she was sentimental, but because she knew that men who had eaten well thought more clearly and held their nerve better, and she needed every man on this property thinking clearly today. When the plates were cleared, she caught Pete on his way out and said quietly, "You talk to the others." "Every one of them," he said. Frank backed me up. "They'll be in the yard when Hatch comes. Just present." He paused. "Even old Crenshaw, and Crenshaw don't like anybody." "Good," she said. He started to go, then turned back. "Miss Collins." He stopped. Tried again. "Martha." Something in his face was working through an emotion he didn't quite have the vocabulary for yet. "What you've done here. For the ranch. I want you to know I'm sorry for what I said when you first came." She looked at him steadily. "What you said didn't stop me," she said. "But I appreciate you saying so." He nodded, once sharply, with the particular decisiveness of a young man who is learning to mean things, and he went out. Caleb found her in the kitchen at 9 o'clock, dressed differently than she'd ever seen him, still plainly, nothing that announced anything, but with a quiet correctness to it that she noticed. He had shaved. He carried himself with a stillness that was different from his usual stillness, more deliberate, more held. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her. "How are you?" he said. "Roy?" "Ready, nervous but ready." He paused. "The clerk's statement is signed and witnessed. I have the original deed and my comparison notes from the land office records." And he hesitated just briefly. "Some documentation of my own that may be relevant." She looked at him. "What kind of documentation?" He met her eyes. "The kind that clarifies certain things about the ownership of this ranch." The kitchen went very quiet. She said, and her voice was careful. "Is there something you need to tell me before Hatch arrives?" He opened his mouth, and then they both herded horses in the lane, more than two, moving at the deliberate pace of men who expected to be received. His jaw tightened. He said, "I promise, after." She held his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then she untied her apron, folded it on the table, and said, "Then let's go." Gerald Hatch arrived with Judge Harmon, his 2 suited companions, and 2 additional men she didn't recognize, larger, quieter, positioned slightly behind the others in the particular way of men hired to make a statement through their presence. Hatch himself was exactly as she'd imagined him from the voice she'd heard through the window the first time he came, well-dressed, comfortable, with the satisfied ease of a man who had done this before and expected it to go the same way it had always gone. Judge Harmon was older than she'd expected, mid-60s, white-haired, with a sharp, watchful face that said he had been doing this long enough to have seen most of what men were capable of, and had arrived at a sustainable opinion of humanity that was somewhere between cynical and fair. He looked at the assembled ranch hands in the yard, looked at Roy, and then looked, with brief but genuine surprise, at Martha standing beside Roy. Hatch smiled when he saw the crowd. "Quite a gathering," he said pleasantly. "I hope we haven't caused any alarm. This is a simple matter of clarifying a boundary question." "Simple matters don't require judges," Roy said. Hatch's smile stayed exactly where it was. "Judge Harmon is here as a courtesy, to make the resolution official and avoid any future confusion." He looked at Harmon. "Your Honor, if you'd like to review the documents." "I'll review them when I'm ready, Mr. Hatch," Judge Harmon said, in a tone that suggested he was nobody's stage prop. He looked at Roy. "You're the foreman?" Roy straightened. "Yes, sir, and who speaks for the property?" There was a beat, just a half second, but she felt it, and then Caleb stepped forward. "I do," he said. Something happened in that moment. She watched Hatch's expression very carefully, and she saw something in it that she filed away immediately, not surprised, but the particular tightening of a man who had expected a different complication and had just encountered the one he'd been hoping to avoid. He knows, she thought. Hatch knows who Caleb is. Judge Harmon looked at Caleb with the kind of assessment that had nothing theatrical about it. "And you are?" "Caleb Whitmore," Caleb said. "I own Red Willow Ranch." The yard went so quiet that she could hear Pete Hartley, standing behind her and to the left, make a small involuntary sound that was entirely beyond his control. She felt the words land in her chest like something thrown hard from a distance. Not surprising exactly, because some part of her had been moving toward this understanding for days, but landing with a weight she hadn't fully anticipated. She kept her face still. She kept her breathing even. She had known how to do that for a long time. Roy's expression did not change, which told her Roy had known. Standing at the edge of the group, gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, like a man whose private theory had just been confirmed. Hatch recovered faster than most men would have, Mr. Whitmore, he said smoothly. I wasn't aware you were in residence. You assumed correctly, Caleb said, which was the point. He looked at Judge Harmon. I've been working this ranch for the past month as a hand rather than as the owner. I wanted to understand its operations directly. I'm sorry for any confusion that caused. He did not sound particularly sorry. He sounded like a man who had made a decision and was comfortable with it. What I'm not sorry for is what it allowed us to discover about Mr. Hatch's claim. Harmon looked between them. Let's see the documents, he said. They moved to the porch of the main house. Hatch, his two suited men, Harmon and Caleb. Martha stayed where she was in the yard, and she was fine with that. Her part in this was already done. What happened on that porch now depended on the documents, and the documents were solid. But then Judge Harmon, settling into the chair Roy had brought out for him and arranging the papers on the small table, looked up and out at the yard and said to Caleb, Is there anyone who can walk me through the comparison between these two documents, specifically the inconsistencies your side is alleging? Caleb didn't hesitate. He turned and looked directly at her. Yes, he said. She walked up the porch steps. Hatch looked at her the way men like Hatch looked at women like Martha, a quick evaluation and instant dismissal. The particular arrogance of a man who had never once in his life been surprised by a woman, and therefore did not believe surprises were available. This is the ranch cook, Hatch said to Harmon, with a smile that was designed to manage the room. A fine cook, I'm sure, but perhaps someone more. I'll decide who I want to explain things to me, Judge Harmon said, without looking up from the document he was examining. Ma'am, your name? Martha Collins, she said. Miss Collins, can you walk me through what you found? She stepped to the table. She did not look at Hatch. She looked at the documents and at the judge, and she began. She explained it the way she had always explained difficult things, directly, without decoration, with the confidence of someone who had done the work and knew it. She took the judge through the boundary language in the original deed. She showed him the discrepancy in the stamp positioning. She explained the date notation format and when it had changed. She showed him the clerk's written statement, signed and witnessed, confirming that no amendment appeared in the filing records for that district between 1,876 and 1,880. She had been speaking for perhaps 8 minutes when Hatch interrupted. With respect, Your Honor, this woman is a cook. She has no legal training, no surveying experience, and no basis to. The stamp, Harmon said, not to Hatch but to his own inspection of the document. Where's the original stamp it's purported to copy? Caleb placed a second document on the table, something he'd obtained in Billings, a certified example of the territorial stamp from that period. Harmon held the two side by side. He looked at them for a long, careful moment. This positioning, he said slowly. The emblem is off-center to the left on Hatch's document. Consistently, across every authentic document from that office, the emblem is centered, Martha said. I confirmed that with the head clerk. Harmon looked up at her. You spoke with the clerk directly? Mr. Whitmore did, at my direction, she said. The clerk provided the written statement you're holding. Hatch's pleasant expression had been developing a hairline crack for the past 5 minutes, and she could see it widening now. This is circumstantial, he started. Mr. Hatch, Harmon's voice was not loud, but it had the quality of something that ended conversations. I'd like you to stop talking for a few minutes. Hatch stopped talking. Harmon read the clerk's statement. He read it a second time. He looked at the date notation on the amendment, and he looked at Caleb and said, You have confirmation that the notation format changed before this document is dated. The clerk provided a documented example of the format change, Caleb said. Effective January of 77, the format on Hatch's amendment was retired at that point. Harmon set all the documents down on the table. He looked at Hatch. "Mr. Hatch," he said, "this amendment has 3 significant problems. The stamp positioning is inconsistent with every authenticated document from the same office. The date notation format was discontinued before this document's stated date. And the file doesn't appear in the territorial records." He paused. "Now, I am not here to make a criminal determination today. That is a matter for a different proceeding, but I am here to determine whether this amendment can be used as the basis for a water rights claim. And my determination is that it cannot." Hatch's face had stopped performing pleasantness. What was underneath was harder and colder, and she thought, frightened in the specific way of a man who had run this play before, and was only now encountering someone who knew how to stop it. "This is not over," he said. "For the purposes of this proceeding it is," Harmon said. Hatch stood up abruptly, gathering his papers, and looked at Martha with the full weight of his contempt, not bothering to hide it now that the politeness had served its purpose and failed. "A cook," he said. "They sent a cook against me." Martha looked at him calmly. "No," she said. "A person who pays attention." He held her gaze for a moment, and she could see him deciding whether to say something more. Whatever he saw in her face caused him to decide against it. He went down the porch steps without another word, and his 2 suited men followed him, and the 2 large quiet men followed them, and the lane carried them away in a slow, furious procession. The yard was very still, and then Pete Hartley, somewhere behind her, said "Ha," in a tone that was everything relief and pride, and the particular vindication of a young man who had put faith something and been right. She heard it ripple through the hands. She heard Frank Greer make that sound, the real version of it this time, the one that was unambiguously a laugh. Judge Harmon stood, collecting his things, and looked at her with the expression of a man who had been in this business long enough to know when he'd seen something worth noting. "Miss Collins," he said, "that was thorough work." "Thank you, Your Honor," she said. He nodded to Caleb, nodded to Roy, and went to find his horse. Roy let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for several days. He put his hand on the porch railing and just stood there for a moment, and she could see the relief move through him in a visible wave. And she thought of what he'd said the night before, "This ranch is better because of you," and she felt the truth of this moment land in her in a way she hadn't let herself feel during it. Because during it she'd needed to be clear-headed and precise, and she'd been exactly that, and now it was over. And the water rights were intact, and Red Willow Ranch was still standing. She became aware that Caleb was beside her. She had been aware of him the whole time she was always aware of when he was in the room, which was its own kind of information she had been careful not to examine too directly. But now, with the crisis over, and the porch quieting, and Roy going to talk to the hands who were crowding the steps wanting to know what had happened, Caleb was simply there, beside her. Close enough that she could have reached out and touched him if she'd had any reason to do so. She turned to look at him. He looked back at her, and his face was open in a way she had not seen before. The careful, controlled quality he wore like a second coat was down, or at least partially down, and what was underneath was something she didn't yet have a word for. "I own the ranch," he said. "I heard you say so," she said. "I should have told you before today." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He didn't look away. "I need to explain." "You do," she said. She kept her voice even because she was not going to have this conversation on a porch with 20 men orbiting them. "But not right now. I need to get dinner started, and you need to finish with Roy and the judge, and we can talk tonight when things have settled." He looked at her with that expression she still hadn't fully catalogued, the one with the weight behind it, and he said, "You're not going to make this easy." "Making things easy that aren't easy is how you end up with worse problems," she said. "Tonight, Caleb." She went back into the kitchen. She started dinner with her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions: fire up, check the pot, start the stock, while her mind was doing something entirely different from cooking. It was running through the past month in the new light of what she now knew, re-examining every conversation, every moment in the kitchen, every evening on the stool by the back door. Every time he'd known exactly where every fence line ran, and why the north pasture had the drainage problem it did, and what the supply books showed about the past 3 years of management. Every time Roy had asked his opinion on something a foreman didn't ask ranch hands. Every time the older men had watched him with that particular regard. She felt she had to be honest with herself about this. She had always been honest with herself. It was non-negotiable. She felt two things at once. And they were not comfortable companions. The first was a pride that surprised her in its sharpness. She had walked in here with 47 cents, and no one willing to give her a fair chance, and in 1 month she had learned this place well enough to catch the thing that could have destroyed it. She had done real consequential work. She had mattered. The second was something more complicated, something that sat in the chest and pressed. She had thought she had started to believe that she had found someone who saw her as an equal. Not a project, not an object of sympathy, not a woman whose worth needed to be established against all evidence. Just someone who saw her clearly and valued what they saw. She had told herself not to draw conclusions before she had the evidence. But she had drawn them anyway, slowly and without permission, over 4 weeks of quiet afternoons and shared bowls of soup and a man who fixed her oven door and listened to her the way people listened when they intended to remember. And now the picture had an element she hadn't known to account for. Caleb Whitmore was the owner of Red Willow Ranch. He was almost certainly a man of substantial means. He had come into his own kitchen, and helped her carry groceries and fixed her stove and sat on her stool drinking her coffee, and she had not known the whole truth of who she was talking to. The question that sat in the chest and pressed was not whether he was a good man. She was fairly certain he was a good man. The evidence for that had been consistent and specific, which in her experience was more trustworthy than any amount of charm. The question was whether what had grown between them quietly, unhurriedly, in the specific way that things grew when no one was forcing them, had grown between equals. Or whether it had grown in a fiction she hadn't known was one. She didn't have the answer yet. She added salt to the pot, stirred it, and adjusted the heat. Tonight, she had told him. Tonight they would talk. Frank Greer came into the kitchen at 4, the way he did some days, and poured himself coffee from the pot on the back of the stove, and sat down without being asked, and said nothing for a long, comfortable moment. Then you knew about him. Not entirely, she said. But you suspected. She kept her eyes on her work. I noticed things, she said. I didn't draw conclusions I didn't have evidence for. But you knew he was more than a hand. She was quiet for a moment. I knew he knew this ranch the way owners know land, she said. I didn't know what that meant until this morning. Frank turned his mug in his hands. He's a good man, he said. Came out here 6 months ago when his father passed and left him the property. Spent the first 2 months trying to understand what he'd inherited and who was on it. Worked alongside everyone. He paused. I'm the only one who knew. He asked me not to say. Martha stopped working. She turned and looked at Frank Greer, old Frank, with his gray mustache and his minimal words and his sustainable opinions of humanity, and she understood why he was telling her this. He was telling her this because he thought she needed the context, and because he was, in his particular unexpansive way, on her side. He didn't know what he had here, Frank continued. The ranch, the people. He needed to find out the real way. He looked at her steadily. Then you arrived, and he started understanding what he had a great deal faster. Martha turned back to the stove. She stirred the pot for a long moment. He should have told me, she said. Yes, Frank said. He should have. He finished his coffee and set the mug down. But I reckon you already know why he didn't. He went back out. She stood at the stove and thought about a man who had inherited a piece of land and not known who he could trust, and had found a way to find out that cost him the one thing you could never get back if you spent it wrong: honesty. She thought about that for a long time. When the dinner dishes were cleared and the hands had drifted off, and Roy had gone to write his own account of the day's events down in the ledger he kept in the office, She came out of the kitchen and found Caleb sitting on the back steps, not performing patience, just being still the way he was still, in that quality of waiting that was never passive. She sat down beside him, not close enough to be a statement, close enough to have the conversation. The night was warm and quiet, and the summer dark had that particular depth that came after a day that had burned hard and then resolved. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me why." And he did. He told her everything. Not the polished version, not the version a man told when he was trying to make himself look better than the facts supported. The real version, with the awkward parts left in, and the moments that didn't reflect well on him presented at their actual size. His father had died in February, a hard winter death, fast and without much warning. A man who had been vigorous and difficult and present in Caleb's life the way a stone wall was present. Something you navigated around so automatically that you forgot to imagine what the landscape looked like without it. And then the stone wall was gone, and the landscape was unrecognizable. And what his father had left behind was a ranch Caleb had visited a handful of times over the years but never truly known, managed by a foreman he respected but barely knew, worked by men whose names he had to learn from a ledger. He had come out in March, after the estate was settled enough to allow it, and he had spent the first 2 weeks trying to have the conversations a new owner was supposed to have formal, managerial. The kind where you asked about the accounts and the herd numbers and the state of the fencing, and people gave you answers they'd prepared. And he'd found that those answers were correct and useless in equal measure, because they told him what the ranch was on paper, and nothing about what it was in practice. Nothing about who actually kept it running and who was coasting. Nothing about where the real problems were, versus where people were accustomed to pointing when someone official asked. So he had stopped having those conversations. He had put on work clothes and gone out with the hands for 3 days, not announcing anything, just another man who'd come looking for work during the spring push. Roy had known he'd had to tell Roy, because Roy was not a man you deceived without consequence, but Roy had understood, or at least had understood enough to go along with it. Even if his opinions on the wisdom of the approach had been communicated in the silence he used when he disagreed with something, but was choosing not to argue. And then Martha said, "And then you arrived," he said. She waited. "I was going to tell Roy to hire you before I even met you," he said. Agnes Whitfield's recommendation carried weight, and we needed someone badly. He paused. "And then you walked up the porch steps, and Pete said what he said. And you looked at him the way you did, and you kept walking. And that was remarkable to you," she said, without irony or bitterness, just wanting the truth. "I'd spent 3 months watching people perform what they thought I wanted to see," he said. And here was a woman who'd just been spoken to that way, and she'd kept walking, and she wasn't performing anything. She just started again. "You were exactly what you were." I didn't know how to account for it at first. Martha listened to this. She listened to all of it. The way she listened to things she intended to keep carefully, fully, without interrupting. "The first week," he said, "I kept telling myself I was observing the kitchen operations. Seeing whether the hire was working out." He looked at his hands. "That stopped being true somewhere in the second week." "When did you decide to tell me?" she asked. The question landed quietly, but it landed hard. He was honest. "I kept finding reasons not to," he said. "At first because I thought it would change how you treated me, and I didn't want to be treated like an employer, because what was happening between us was something I hadn't had in a long time and didn't want to lose. And then later because I'd waited too long, and the longer you wait with something like that, the worse the telling becomes." He paused. "And then Hatch. And Wednesday happened before I could find the right moment." "There were right moments," she said. "You chose not to take them." "Yes," he said, not defending it, just confirming it. She sat with that for a while. The night was quiet around them, and neither of them moved to fill the silence, which had always been one of the things she respected about him. He never used words to cover ground he hadn't actually covered. "Caleb," she said finally, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it straight." "All right, what did you think I was going to do with the truth?" She kept her voice even. Did you think I was going to change? Start treating you differently because you had money? He was quiet for a long moment. No, he said. I didn't think that. Then what were you afraid of? Another long pause. And then he said something she hadn't expected. I was afraid you'd leave. She looked at him. Not because of anger, he said. Because of stopped. Tried again. Because the distance between what I am and what you thought I was would feel too large. Because a woman like you, who has worked for everything she has and been turned away at every door, I was afraid that finding out I was the man who owned the door would make it impossible. That it would put something between us that couldn't be undone. He looked at her directly. I was afraid I would lose you before I had any right to have you. The back steps were quiet. The ranch was quiet. Martha looked at this man who had fixed her oven door and carried her groceries, and sat on a kitchen stool and listened to her, like her words were worth retaining, and she thought about the specific cruelty of the thing he'd done, and the specific human smallness of the reason behind it, and she thought, well, there it is, the full picture. She did not forgive him in that moment. She was not a woman who forgave quickly because quick forgiveness was so often just avoidance dressed up as grace. But she understood, which was a different thing, and in her experience understanding was the necessary first step. You were protecting yourself, she said. Yes. And in doing that you made a decision about what I could handle, she said. Without asking me, he flinched. Just slightly, but she saw it. Yes, he said, that's the part I mind, she said. Not the secret. Not the money. Not any of that. The part where you looked at me and decided what I was capable of knowing and made the choice for me. He said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. I have had people make that choice for me my entire life, she said, and her voice stayed level because she needed it level, not because she wasn't feeling what she was saying. Every ranch that turned me away made that choice. Every person who looked at me and decided what I could and couldn't do before I'd opened my mouth made that choice. I came here because I needed work and I had nowhere else to go, and I stayed because— She stopped. Restarted. I stayed because this place needed me, and I was good at what I did, and I found something here I had not expected to find. She looked at him. He was watching her with that full, unguarded attention, not looking for a gap to defend himself in, just listening. And I need the person I found here, she continued, to be someone who doesn't make that choice. Who doesn't look at me and decide what I can handle. She let that sit. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Yes, he said, and his voice was quiet and certain. I understand. Then we can talk about what comes next, she said. But not tonight, I need to think. She stood up from the step. He stood too, and for a moment they were very close enough that she could see the full weight of what he was holding, and it was not guilt exactly. It was the particular heaviness of a man who had been shown something true about himself that he was not proud of and was deciding what to do about it. Martha, he said. She waited. I'm not going to ask you to decide anything tonight, he said. I'm not going to make any more decisions on your behalf about what you can handle. But I want you to stop. What I feel is not complicated by what I own. It has nothing to do with it. I know you don't need me to tell you that. But I needed to say it. She looked at him for a long moment. Good night, Caleb, she said. Good night, he said. She went inside. She did not sleep well. It was not anguish. She had known enough actual anguish in her life to know the difference. But it was the particular restlessness of a problem she could see multiple sides of and had not yet resolved. She lay in the cot in the room off the kitchen, and she thought about everything he'd said, and everything she'd said, and everything that had happened in the past month, and she was honest with herself about all of it. She was not angry that he had money. She was not angry that he owned the ranch. Those things were simply facts, and facts were what they were, and she had never had the luxury of pretending otherwise. What she was, she searched for the right word in the dark, was unsettled. Unsettled by the particular form his fear had taken, and by the question underneath it that she had not yet fully examined, whether what had grown between them had grown in something real. She had spent her whole life being underestimated. She had learned to carry herself through that, without losing her footing. What she had not spent her whole life having was someone sit beside her and listen like she was worth listening to, and the specific terror of the moment when you realized the person doing that had not told you the whole truth was not simple. But here was the thing she kept coming back to. Lying in the dark with her hands folded on her chest, the listening had been real. She was certain of that. She could feel the difference between performance and genuine attention, had developed that skill the hard way over many years, and what she had seen in Caleb Whitmore every time they'd been in a room together had been genuine. The interest in her ideas, the care he took with her working space, the way he'd stood in the kitchen and listened to her talk about mining camps and boarding houses in Helena, like those places, and that history were worth knowing. That had been real. The deception had been about fear, not calculation. She understood the difference. She did not sleep well, but she woke up clear. The next morning she was at the stove before 5, same as always. And when Caleb came through the kitchen door, at his usual time, that in-between hour, the late afternoon slot that had become theirs by habit, she was in the middle of inventory. Sitting at the work table with her supply ledger, because the supply order for the following week needed to go to Roy by Friday, and she would not let personal complications affect the functioning of this kitchen. He came in and she looked up and she said, "Sit down." He sat down. She finished the line she was writing. Then she closed the ledger and looked at him. "I'm not leaving," she said. Something moved through his face, quick and unguarded. "Martha, let me finish," she said. "I'm not leaving. Not because I'm out of options. I want to be clear, that's not what this is. I'm not leaving because this place is good work and I'm good at it, and walking away from good work because of a complicated situation is not something I'm willing to do." She held his gaze. "And I'm not leaving because I am not done figuring out what this is between us. And I don't make decisions about things I haven't finished figuring out." He was very still. "But I need things to be different," she said. "Specifically, I need to be told the truth. All of it. Not the parts you've decided I'm ready for. Not the version that protects you from my reaction. The full truth when it matters." She paused. "Can you do that?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I'm going to hold you to that," she said. "I know," he said. She opened her ledger again. "Now tell me what I should know about this ranch that I don't know yet." The full picture. Accounts, outstanding obligations, anything Hatch's stunt might have stirred up, that's going to come back around. He blinked. Then something in his face shifted, something that might have been, in another kind of man, the beginning of laughter. But in Caleb was more like the particular relief of tension releasing. He pulled the other stool out from under the table and sat down properly, and he told her. He told her all of it. The accounts, which were genuinely not bad given 3 months of poor management under the previous arrangements. The outstanding fencing repairs, which were more significant than Roy had communicated, because Roy was an optimist by nature. The question of the herd size for the coming winter, which needed a decision before September. The 2 ranch hands who had been with the property for nearly a decade, and whose loyalty was genuine, and whose wages had been underpaid since his father's health declined, and who deserved an adjustment. She wrote things down as he talked. He noticed her writing and said, "You don't have to." "I think better when I write," she said. "Keep going." He kept going. An hour later, when he was done, she had 4 pages of notes and a clearer picture of Red Willow Ranch than she'd had before, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her in its certainty that the picture looked manageable. Not without problems, not without work, but manageable in the way that things were manageable when you understood them properly. "The kitchen savings," she said. He looked at her. "What about them? In the past month, by reorganizing the supply system and reducing waste, I've cut the kitchen expenses by approximately 1/3, she said. "I've been tracking it. I can show you the numbers." "I know," he showed me. She looked up from her notes. "Roy showed you last week," he said. He stopped. "He was showing me what you'd done. He was proud of you. He's not a demonstrative man, but he was proud of you." Martha looked back down at her ledger. She was quiet for a moment. The wages for those 2 long-term hands, she said. That should happen soon. Not as a grand gesture, just correctly. I'll talk to Roy today, he said. Good, she closed the ledger. I need to start dinner. He stood. He didn't move toward the door immediately. She could feel him there, not pressing, not performing patience, just present in the way he was present. That quality of attention that still undid her slightly, if she let herself feel it. Martha, he said. Thank you, he said. For not leaving. And he paused. For being exactly what you are. I know I don't have the right to say that right now. But I needed you to hear it. She looked at him for a long moment. You're going to have to earn the right, she said. Through what you do, not what you say. You know that. I know, he said. I'm going to. She believed him. Not because she was naive, she was the opposite of naive. She had been educated in the ways people disappointed you by the accumulated tuition of 30 years, but because she had been watching this man for a month, and she had learned to read the difference between what he said and what he meant, and right now they were the same thing. He went out. She started dinner. What happened in the next 3 weeks was quieter than what had come before, but it was not less significant. Caleb told the hands, all of them, formally, over breakfast on a Thursday morning, who he was. He did it simply, without drama, the way he did most things. He said he'd been working alongside them to understand the operation before making decisions about its future, that he was grateful for their work, and that the ranch was in better shape than it would have been without them. He did not make promises he couldn't keep. He answered questions directly when they were asked. Pete Hartley's first question was, does that mean Martha's the owner's cook or just the cook? Caleb looked at him. Miss Collins is the ranch cook, he said, in a tone that closed that particular avenue of inquiry. Pete nodded, satisfied, as though the distinction he'd been trying to draw had clarified something for him. Frank Greer didn't say anything during the meeting. Afterward, when it had broken up and the hands were heading back to work, he walked past Caleb and said, quietly and without stopping, "Your father would have liked her," and kept walking. Caleb stood in the yard for a moment after that, and Martha, who had seen it through the kitchen window, turned back to her work and did not comment on it, because some things were not hers to touch. The thing that shifted between her and Caleb was not dramatic. It did not happen in a moment or resolve itself in a single conversation. It was more like what happened when you gave something the right conditions and then stepped back. It grew the way it was going to grow, in its own direction, at its own pace. And your job was not to force it, but to make sure you weren't getting in its way. He came to the kitchen in the afternoons, same as before. They talked. He asked her opinion on things, the ranch operations, the decisions coming up, the question of the winter herd, and he listened to her answers with the same quality of attention he always had, but now without the layer of management underneath it, without the protective screen of the identity he'd been maintaining. And she found that she trusted what she saw on the other side of that screen more, not less, than what she'd seen through it. He was direct with her in ways he hadn't been before. He told her when he'd made a decision she might not agree with, and why. He told her about a letter from a business associate in Denver that was pressuring him toward certain decisions about the herd that he was inclined to resist. He told her about the particular loneliness of having inherited something large and complicated and not having anyone to talk it through with. "You have Roy," she said. "Roy tells me what the ranch needs," he said. "That's different from talking it through." She thought about that. "And you're talking it through with me," she said. "Is that all right?" She looked at him across the table. "Yes," she said. "It's all right." It was during the second week of that period that Gerald Hatch sent a letter. Roy brought it to her, which was itself noteworthy. He brought it to the kitchen before he brought it to Caleb, and she thought she understood why. He wanted her to see it first. She read it standing at the work table, and her face did not change, because she had developed the skill of reading bad news without her face changing as a survival mechanism, and the letter was definitely bad news. Hatch was not done. The letter addressed to Caleb, formally and correctly, as the owner of record stated his intention to pursue the water rights claim through formal territorial court proceedings, and attached to it was a statement from a different judge, not Harmon, alleging irregularities in how Wednesday's informal proceeding had been conducted. There was also at the bottom of the letter something that made her read the paragraph twice. A statement that the fraudulent amendment allegation was itself a fabrication and that Hatch intended to pursue a defamation claim against anyone who had advanced it publicly, including by name Martha Collins. Roy was watching her face. "Caleb needs to see this," she said. "I know," Roy said. "I wanted you to see it first." Why? He was quiet for a moment. "Because your name is in it," he said, "and because you deserve to decide how you want to handle that, before it becomes someone else's decision to make." She looked at Roy Dempsey, tired Roy, the man who had let her in the door when nobody else would, and she felt, for the first time since she'd arrived at this ranch, something that was unambiguously gratitude without any of the other things mixed in. "Thank you, Roy," she said. She took the letter to Caleb herself. He read it at the kitchen table, and she watched his face, the way she always watched people's faces when they were reading something important. Not to pry, but because faces told you what the words were landing on. His jaw tightened. He read the part with her name just. She could tell by the slight pause, the way his eyes tracked back before continuing. When he finished, he set the letter on the table and looked at it for a moment. "He's bluffing on the defamation claim," he said. "He knows what we have." "Probably," she said. "But that's not the problem." He looked at her. "What's the problem?" "The problem," she said, "is that he has money and patience and lawyers in Billings and possibly judges who owe him favors. And this letter is designed to make the cost of fighting him feel larger than the cost of settling. He's going to keep coming until someone makes it more expensive to continue than to stop." Caleb was quiet. "The clerk's statement isn't enough for a formal proceeding," she continued. "We need her to appear. We need the filing records physically presented, not just described. We need documentation of the other ranches he's done this to, because a pattern is what turns a single irregularity into a case that a territorial judge takes seriously." She paused. "And we need a lawyer. I know a lawyer in Billings," he said. "Of course you do," she said, without edge, just acknowledging the reality of his world. He looked at Martha. "The defamation allegations is a scare tactic," she said. "I know what I found and I know how I found it, and I'm not afraid of Gerald Hatch. You should be a little afraid of him." And his voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, something protective that was not quite protective, something that was the cousin of it. "He has resources and he doesn't care who he hurts." "I've been not cared about by people with resources before," she said. "I'm still here." He looked at her with that expression, the one she still couldn't entirely categorize, the one with the weight behind it. "Yes," he said. She held his gaze. "I'll write to the lawyer today," he said. "I'll write to the clerk and ask her about appearing." And he stopped. "There's something else I can do. Something I should have done before now. I have contacts in the territorial land office at the highest level. He paused. "I've been hesitant to use them because it feels like leveraging something I didn't earn. But Hatch using forged documents and coming after you by name has resolved that hesitation." She looked at him. "You have contacts at the territorial level." "My father knew people," he said. "I've kept the relationships because it would have been foolish not to. I've just been reluctant to use them for personal advantage. Using them to expose a forger who's committed fraud against multiple properties is not personal advantage," she said. "That's what those relationships are for." He nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "I know that, Caleb." She waited until he was looking at her directly. "Stop treating your own resources like a character flaw. You have things that can help people. Use them." He was quiet for a long moment. And then something in his posture changed, something she would not have noticed if she hadn't been watching him for a month, a small fundamental shift, like a door settling properly into its frame, and he said, "All right." "Good," she said. "Now write those letters." He wrote 4 letters that afternoon. She knew because he came back to the kitchen twice to ask her opinion on specific language, which she gave directly and without softening it, and he incorporated it without argument or negotiation. The fourth letter she didn't know about until later. She found out about it a week later, when two men from the Territorial Land Office arrived at Red Willow Ranch, unannounced, not Hatch's kind of arrival, not smooth and rehearsed, but the slightly dusty, purposeful arrival of men who had ridden a long way because what they were investigating was serious. They spent 2 hours with Caleb and Roy and the documents. Martha was not in the meeting. She was in the kitchen, because the kitchen was where she worked and where she was needed. And she had not been invited to the meeting, which she was entirely at peace with because she had done her part. When the territorial men left, Caleb came to the kitchen. He sat down on the stool by the back door's stool. She thought of it as his stool now, which was a thought she noticed herself having and filed away, and he looked at her with a quietness that contained a great deal. "They're opening a formal investigation," he said. "Into Hatch. Not just the Red Willow claim, all of it. The other properties, the missing stamp, the full pattern." He paused. "The clerk from Billings is cooperating. 2 of the other ranchers he defrauded have come forward." Another pause. "Hatch is going to have considerably larger problems than a water rights dispute." Martha turned from the stove. "Will he be charged?" "Almost certainly," he said. "It'll take time, but yes." She nodded. He was looking at her with that expression again, and she let herself look back at him directly now, without looking away, because she had decided this was something she was allowed to do. "The fourth letter I wrote, the one to the territorial office." He paused. She went very still. "Not about the case," he said. "About the work you did. About what you found and how you found it and the quality of analysis you brought to it. There's a new territorial settlement administrator position being created in Billings. Someone with exactly your skills: organization, record analysis, supply and account management, the ability to understand a document and know when something's wrong." He held her gaze. The kitchen was very quiet. "You recommended me," she said slowly. "I told them the truth," he said, "about what you did. About what you're capable of. I didn't inflate it or embellish it. I didn't have to, because the truth was sufficient." He stopped. "I should have asked you first. I know that, and if you're angry that I did it without asking, I understand. But I'm not going to apologize for telling people what you're worth." Martha looked at this man on his stool in her kitchen. She thought of it as her kitchen. That was simply what it was. And she thought about 47 cents and a cracked recipe book and every door that had been closed in her face. She thought about what it meant to have someone tell the truth about you to people who had the power to act on it. Not a favor, not charity, just the truth, told without qualification to people who needed to hear it. Her eyes were dry. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she was not going to start now. "You should have asked me first," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm learning." She turned back to the stove. Her hands were steady. "I'll need to think about it," she said. "The position." "Take all the time you need," he said. "It doesn't change what I'm doing here," she said. "This kitchen still needs to function. I know that," he said. She stirred the pot. The kitchen smelled like dinner, like something good coming together out of what was available, which was how she had always done her best work. She said, "When I think about it." She kept her eyes on the stove. "Whatever I decide, I'm not deciding it because of you. I'm deciding it because of what I want." "That's exactly how it should be," he said. "I'd want nothing else." She nodded once. She continued stirring. He didn't leave immediately. He sat on the stool for another quarter hour while she finished the meal, and they talked about the investigation and what it would likely mean for the other affected ranchers. And he asked her what she thought the timeline would be for formal proceedings. And she told him what she thought, and he listened the way he always listened, like what she thought was worth building on. It was almost dinner time when Pete Hartley appeared in the kitchen doorway, slightly out of breath and with the particular expression of someone who had news. "There's a woman at the gate," he said. "Says she's from the Territorial Land Office." Says she's here about the investigation. He paused. She asked specifically for Martha Collins. Caleb looked at Martha. Martha untied her apron. She folded it neatly on the corner of the work table, the same work table she'd set her cracked recipe book on the first day she'd walked in here, and she straightened her back and looked at Caleb one time with the particular expression she used when things were about to happen and she was ready for them. "Tell her I'll be right out," she said. The woman at the gate was named Clara Hess, and she was not what Martha had expected. She was perhaps 50, compact and precise in her movements, with the kind of face that had logged a great many years of being taken seriously in rooms where that had required effort. She wore a plain traveling coat and carried a leather satchel that was worn at the corners in the way of a bag that had been to many places and intended to go to more. She looked at Martha when Pete brought her through the gate, and her gaze was direct and unhurried. And Martha recognized the quality of it immediately, because it was the same quality she brought to looking at things herself, the look of someone taking accurate inventory rather than making a judgment. "Miss Collins," Clara Hess said. "That's right," Martha said. "My name is Clara Hess. I'm the records examiner for the Territorial Land Office, Northern District." She extended her hand, and Martha shook it a firm, businesslike shake. Two women who had both learned that the handshake mattered. "I've read Mr. Whitmore's letter about your work on the Hatch document. I'd like to hear about it from you directly, if you're willing." "I'm willing," Martha said. "Come inside." She brought Clara Hess into the kitchen, because the kitchen was where Martha worked, and where she thought clearly, and she poured 2 cups of coffee without asking whether they were wanted because they were clearly wanted, and she sat down at the work table across this woman and told her everything. From the original document, she'd been shown to the specific inconsistencies she'd identified to the questions she'd known to ask, because she'd spent 12 years managing accounts and records, and learning the difference between a document that was what it claimed to be, and one that was trying to look like something it wasn't. Clara Hess listened without interrupting. She took notes. When Martha finished, she looked at her notes for a moment, and then looked up. "The stamp positioning," she said. "You identified that yourself, without prior knowledge of how territorial stamps were formatted." "I identified that it was inconsistent with other official documents I'd seen," Martha said. Caleb Mr. Whitmore confirmed the specific reason for the inconsistency. "The stamp being pre-move. But the date notation," Clara said. "That was yours."
Yes.
Clara tapped her pencil against her notebook. "Miss Collins, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, without worrying about whether the answer is what you think I want to hear." "That's the only way I answer things," Martha said. Clara looked at her steadily. "Have you done this kind of work before? Formally? Any position that involved document examination, records verification, account analysis?" "Not formally," Martha said. "Practically, in the course of managing households and kitchens and supply accounts for the past 12 years, yes. Constantly. And you've never had any formal recognition of those skills." It was not quite a question. Martha answered it anyway. "I've had the satisfaction of doing the work well," she said. That's been sufficient. Something moved through Clara Hess's face, just a flicker, but Martha caught it, the way she caught most things. "The position Mr. Whitmore wrote about," Clara said. "The settlement administrator role. I need to be clear with you that I'm not here representing that position. That's a separate process and a separate decision. I'm here about the investigation." She paused. "But I'm also here because in 20 years of records work, I have met very few people who would have caught what you caught, the way you caught it. And I wanted to know what kind of person that was." Martha held her gaze. "Now you know," she said. Clara Hess allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "Now I know," she said. They talked for another hour. Clara went through the documents again. She had copies, and Martha walked her through each point the same way she'd walked Judge Harmon through them, directly and specifically, without decoration. Clara asked precise questions, and Martha gave precise answers, and by the end of it there was between them the particular respect that develops when two capable people have been completely straight with each other. When Clara stood to leave, she said, The investigation is going to require testimony. From you, from Mr. Whitmore, from the clerk in Billings. It will take time. These things always do. She paused at the kitchen door. But I want you to know, Miss Collins, that what you did here, the work you did on those documents, in the time you had, that's not a small thing. What Hatch has done to these ranchers is not a small thing either. And the person who stopped it from continuing is standing in front of me. Martha was quiet for a moment. The person who stopped it from continuing was everyone on this ranch, who'd had then to take it seriously when they needed to, she said. I just found the mechanism. Clara looked at her with those accurate eyes. Don't do that, she said, not unkindly. Martha looked back at her. Don't reduce what you did to something smaller than it was, Clara said. I've spent 20 years watching people do that, particularly women. It doesn't serve you and it doesn't serve accuracy, and you seem like someone who cares about accuracy. Martha absorbed that. She did not argue with it, because it was correct. Thank you, Miss Hess, she said. Clara said the records examiner and went out. Caleb was waiting in the yard. Of course he was. Martha had learned that he had an instinct for the important moments, an ability to be present when presence was required without making it a performance. He looked at her when she came out. She looked at him. Well, he said. She'll need testimony, Martha said. From both of us. He nodded. How did it go? She thought about Clara Hess and the accurate eyes, and what she'd said at the door. It went well, she said. He looked at her for a moment with that expression, the full, open one she had stopped trying to categorize and had simply started accepting. Good, he said. She went back to the kitchen. She had dinner to finish. What followed was not a single dramatic moment, but a long, gradual settling. The way a house settled after a storm, not quietly, not without the occasional creak or unexpected shift, but fundamentally and in the right direction. The formal investigation into Gerald Hatch consumed 6 weeks, during which 2 territorial investigators came and went from Red Willow 3 times. The clerk from Billings appeared in a formal proceeding in Helena. And Martha gave written testimony that was 47 pages long, which she produced at the kitchen table in the evenings after dinner, with the same methodical care she brought to everything. Hatch's defamation threat against her dissolved within 2 weeks, when his own lawyer apparently explained to him that defamation proceedings required you to prove the statement was false. And proving the statement was false required you to argue that your document was authentic. And arguing that your document was authentic in the face of what Martha and Caleb had assembled was the legal equivalent of trying to put a fire out with lamp oil. She found this out from Caleb, who found it out from his lawyer in Billings, who reported it with what sounded, through the letter, like genuine professional pleasure. The 2 ranchers north of Red Willow who had settled water disputes with Hatch in the past year came forward formally after Clara Hess contacted them. One of them, a widow named Margaret Pratt, who ran a cattle operation with her adult son, rode down to Red Willow one afternoon specifically to speak to Martha. She was a small, determined woman in her 60s with the kind of posture that said she had not arrived at her opinions accidentally, and she sat at Martha's kitchen table and said, I want to know how you found it. Martha told her. Margaret Pratt listened with the focused attention of someone filing information for use. When Martha finished, she said, I signed that settlement because I thought the document was legitimate. My son and we looked at it and we didn't know enough to know it was wrong. She paused. If someone had looked at it the way you looked at Hatch's claim against this ranch, we wouldn't have lost what we lost. I'm sorry, Martha said, and meant it entirely. Don't be sorry, Margaret said. Tell me what to look for in case it happens again. Or in case someone else I know needs to know. So Martha told her that too. She told it carefully, practically, in the language of someone who understood that the most useful knowledge was the kind that could be passed on and applied. Margaret left 2 hours later with 3 pages of notes in her hand. At the door she stopped and looked at Martha and said, You're wasted as a cook, Miss Collins. I'm not wasted at anything I do well, Martha said. Margaret Pratt smiled, sharp and genuine. No, she said. I don't suppose you are. The letter about the settlement administrator position arrived at the end of August, addressed to Martha, which she had not entirely expected. She had assumed it would go to Caleb, or through him, and she had been prepared to feel a certain way about that. The fact that it came to her directly, that someone in the territorial office had understood that the correct address for this letter was Martha Collins. Not Martha Collins' care of the owner of Red Willow Ranch landed in her chest with a warmth she allowed herself to feel fully. She read it at the kitchen table after dinner, alone, with the lamp turned up. The position was in Billings. It was a formal role territorial settlement administrator. Records and accounts division created to address exactly the kind of fraud that Hatch had been running, examining property documents, verifying filings, identifying irregularities before they became the basis for legal action. It paid 3 times what she was earning as a cook. It came with an office and a title, and the authority to request territorial records directly. She sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about 12 years of being turned away. She thought about 47 cents and a cracked recipe book, and every kitchen she had ever managed, and every document she had ever examined, and every system she had ever organized out of chaos. She thought about Clara Hess telling her not to reduce what she'd done to something smaller than it was. She thought about Red Willow Ranch, and what it had become in 2 months, and what it meant to her, and what the man who owned it meant to her. And she was honest with herself about all of it, because she had always been honest with herself. It was the one thing she could control. And then she folded the letter, put it in her apron pocket, and went to find Caleb. He was in the yard, coming in from the north pasture in the last of the evening light, and he saw her coming toward him, and he stopped walking. She could tell from his face that he understood something significant was happening. He had always been good at reading her, better than most people who had known her for years. Which was one of the things she had never entirely resolved about him, that specific quality of being seen. She handed him the letter. He read it. He read it twice, and when he looked up his expression was complicated. She could see pride in it, and something more painful, and something that was making a decision not to say certain things before she'd said what she'd come to say. "Congratulations," he said. "I haven't accepted yet," she said. "I know." He handed her the letter back. "That's your decision." "I need to talk to you about it," she said, "because it affects things here." "I know that too," he said. "Let's talk." They sat on the back steps again, their steps now, she thought, without irony in the warm evening, and she told him what she was thinking. All of it, honestly, the way she'd come to talk to him over the past weeks, with the full truth rather than the managed version. She told him that the position was the right work for her. That she had known it from the moment she'd read it. The same way she always knew when something was right, not with excitement, but with a deep, settling certainty, the feeling of a thing falling into its correct place. She told him that taking it meant leaving Red Willow, and that leaving Red Willow was complicated by what Red Willow had become to her in 2 months, and that she was not going to pretend otherwise. She told him that she was not going to make this decision based on him, and that she needed him to understand that was not because he didn't matter, but because it was the only way she could make a decision she could stand behind. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the yard. "I know what I want to say," he said finally, "and I know it's not my place to say it yet. He stopped. "We're not at a place where I have the standing to ask you to factor me in. I know that. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise just because the situation is giving me a reason to." She looked at him. "Say what you were going to say." He looked at her. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "Not because of the ranch. The ranch will be fine. Roy is good. We'll find another cook who is decent at the work. Not because of," he paused. "Not because of any reason that is about me. I don't want you to leave because I have spent 2 months watching you be exactly what this place needed, and I have spent 2 months. He stopped again, and she could see him choosing his words with the care he chose all important things. "I have spent 2 months understanding what it means to have someone in a room who is fully themselves. Who doesn't perform. Who says what they mean and means what they say, and does the work that needs doing without waiting for permission or recognition. And I don't know how to want that to leave. The yard was very quiet. But he said. But she agreed, waiting. But you took this job because you had 47 cents and nowhere else to go, he said. And whatever you do next, it should be because it's what you want. Not because of me, not because of what's easier, not because of anything except what Martha Collins wants when she's being completely honest about it. He paused. That's what you deserve. And I'm not going to be the reason you don't get it. She sat with that. She sat with the weight and the honesty of it and the specific quality of ache that came with being truly known by someone. I want to take the position, she said. He nodded. And I don't want to lose what this is, she said. He looked at her. You don't have to, he said carefully. Billings is half a day's ride. I have business in Billings regularly, he paused. If you're willing. That's not a small thing, she said. Whatever this is, it's not casual. No, he said. It isn't. Then say what it is, she said straight. No managing. He looked at her for a long, steady moment. I love you, he said. I have been in the process of understanding that since approximately the second week you were here, and I am fully arrived at it now. That's what it is. The evening settled around them. I'm not ready to say that back to you yet, she said. I know, he said. But I'm not going to tell you it's not going in that direction, she said. I know that too, he said, and there was something in his voice, not smug, nothing like that, just a quietness that held something very sure in it. Billings is half a day's ride, she said. Yes, he said. And you'll come regularly, she said, not because the position requires it. Because this does. I will. She nodded once. All right, she said. She wrote her acceptance letter the next morning. She wrote it at the kitchen table, same as everything else she'd ever done at this table, and she wrote it in the clear, direct language she used for everything that mattered. Then she sealed it and gave it to Roy to include with the next supply run into town, and she went back to making breakfast. Her last week at Red Willow was the kind of week that felt longer than it was, because everything in it had a quality of lastness that she was aware of without being sentimental about it. Last Monday, last Thursday's supply count, last batch of bread in the warped oven that Caleb had fixed, and that now seeded perfectly. She trained the new cook, a solid, quiet woman named Dora, who had cooked for a mining operation and had sensible instincts, with the same thoroughness she'd brought to everything. She showed her the supply system, the rotation schedule, the particular trick with the back burner that ran hot on the right side, the fact that Frank Greer took his coffee with no sugar and would not tell you this himself, but would be silently aggrieved if you gave it to him with. Dora was a quick study. Martha felt good about leaving. On the last evening, the hands gathered in the yard in the way that people gathered when something was ending and no one had organized it. They just appeared, drawn by the particular gravity of a conclusion. Frank Greer was there with his coffee cup, which he held like a prop he'd brought to have something to do with his hands. Pete Hartley was there, looking younger than he had the day she'd arrived, which was strange because it should have been the other way around, but she thought what had happened was that something in him had relaxed. Some tension that he'd been carrying that took more energy than he'd realized. Old Crenshaw, who didn't like anybody, had brought his hat off his head and was holding it, which Pete had told her was the equivalent of a standing ovation from Crenshaw. Roy stood beside her and said, in his particular quiet way, "You changed this place, Miss Collins." The place was ready to be changed, she said. I just showed up at the right time. No, Roy said with the gentle firmness of a man who had decided to say a true thing and was going to say it regardless. You changed it. Own that. She thought of Clara Hess saying the same thing words. She thought about how strange it was to be seen after so many years of being looked past. Thank you, Roy, she said, for opening the door. Thank Agnes Whitfield, he said. She sent you. I just had the sense to let you in. Caleb stood at the edge of it, slightly apart in that way he had not isolated but his own space. He had not done anything that announced itself. He had simply been there, all week, in the afternoons in the kitchen, at dinner, in the yard. Present the way he was present, full and attentive and without performance. He walked her to the gate the next morning. Just the two of them, her suitcase in her hand, a different suitcase than the one she'd arrived with. A better one, that she had purchased in town on the supply run 2 weeks earlier because the old one had finally given up its handle for good. The gate, he took her hand, not as a gesture, not as a statement. Just took her hand and held it for a moment, the way you held something you were not letting go of, even when the immediate circumstance required releasing it. "Half a day's ride," she said. "I'll be there in 2 weeks," he said. She looked at him. "Don't make promises you can't keep," she said. "I've heard enough of those in my life." "I know you have," he said. "That's why I'm only making this one." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had fixed her oven door and listened to her about mining camps and sat on a stool and heard her the way she'd needed to be heard for longer than she'd known, and she squeezed his hand once, firmly. Then she picked up her suitcase and went through the gate. The road to Billings was long, and she 2 hours before the morning stage, which was enough time to think and not enough time to second guess, which was exactly the right amount. She walked with her chin up, and her heart doing something complicated, and her step steady, because she was Martha Collins, and she had always walked that way. 2 weeks later, Caleb Whitmore rode into Billings on a Wednesday morning. He tied his horse outside the new Territorial Records office and went inside with his hat in his hand, and the woman at the front desk looked up and told him to take a seat. He took a seat. 5 minutes later, Martha came out from the back in a plain dark dress, with her hair up and a leather satchel in her hand that looked, he thought, like it had already been to several places and intended to go to several more. She saw him, and she did not perform surprise, because she had never performed anything. "You're on time." "I said 2 weeks," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I have a meeting in an hour," she said. "We have time for coffee." They walked down the main street of Billings side by side, and she told him about the first 2 weeks of the position, the files she'd already found that needed reviewing, the 3 property documents she'd flagged as potentially problematic, the particular satisfaction of work that matched the full scope of what she was capable of. She told it without modesty and without inflation, just clearly and directly the way she told everything. And he listened with that attention, that specific full retentive attention that had been one of the first things she'd noticed about him and had never stopped noticing. "You're good at it," he says, she said. "I am." He looked at her sideways, and one corner of his mouth moved in that way she had learned to read. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to tell you something." "All right," he said. "I've been thinking about what you said on the back steps," she said. "At the ranch, what you told me." She looked ahead, not at him. "I've been thinking about it every day for 2 weeks. That's enough time to know whether something is real, or whether it's the circumstance you were in." He said nothing, he was listening. "It's real," she said. "On my end, I wanted you to know that." The street moved around them, horses, townspeople, the ordinary traffic of a Wednesday morning, and none of it was particularly aware that anything significant was happening, which was fine, because what was happening didn't require an audience. Caleb took her hand. She let him. They walked the rest of the way to the coffee shop that way, and she told him about the problematic documents, and he told her about the North Pasture drainage issue that had turned out to be simpler than expected. And they talked the way they had always talked, like 2 people who had not yet run out of things to say to each other and had no reason to believe they were going to. The months that followed were not simple. Nothing worth having was simple, and Martha had learned that lesson early enough that she no longer expected otherwise. The investigation into Gerald Hatch was long and procedurally complicated, and her testimony was required 3 times in formal proceedings and twice in preliminary hearings. And on each occasion she gave it in the same clear, direct, undecorated language she used for everything, and on each occasion the people in the room understood more clearly why the Territorial Land Office had hired her. Hatch was formally charged with document fraud, misrepresentation to a judicial officer, and conspiracy to defraud landowners. His trial was set for the spring. The two ranchers north of Red Willow began the process of recovering what they'd lost. Margaret sent a letter that was 3 pages long and ended with, "You are the kind of woman who changes things without asking whether she has permission to, and the territory needs more of them." Martha kept the letter in the drawer of her desk in the records office, under the leather satchel she'd been to many places with by then. Caleb came to Billings every 2 weeks, then every week then. In November, he came and stayed for 3 days because there were things in the territorial records he needed to review for a legitimate business reason. And Martha did not inquire too closely into the legitimacy of the business reason because she was glad he was there and she was done pretending otherwise. On the 3rd evening of those 3 days, they were sitting in the small front room of the boarding house where she lived, with coffee she'd made because she'd persuaded her landlady to let her use the kitchen, and he said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," she said. He looked at her directly, the way he looked at her when he had decided something and was going to say it without management or performance. "Marry me," he said. She looked at him. "Not because of the ranch," he said. "Not because of anything, except that I want to spend the rest of my life in rooms where you're also in them. And I want the right to say so." He paused. "You told me I had to earn the right through what I did, not what I said. I've been trying to do that for 4 months. I don't think I'm done. I think that's the kind of thing you do indefinitely, but I wanted to ask now, while I still mean it as much as I've ever meant anything." She looked at him for a long moment. "One condition," she said. He waited. "I keep the position," she said. "This work is mine. It's not a detour. It's not something I do until something else comes along. It's what I do." "Yes," he said, without hesitation. "And the ranch is ours," she said. "Not yours, where I happen to live. Ours, where I have standing and voice and my opinion is factored in." "Yes," he said again, "that's what I want. And when you're wrong," she said, "I tell you so." "You already do that," he said. "I want it on the record," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "It's on the record," he said. She looked at him one more time. This man, this specific, difficult, genuine man who had fixed her oven door and hidden his name and been afraid and learned better and showed up every week without being asked and meant what he said, and she said yes. He took her hand, and she let him, and it was the same as always and different from everything. The woman who had walked through the gate of Red Willow Ranch with 47 cents and a cracked recipe book and no one willing to see past the surface of her became the woman who helped bring Gerald Hatch to trial, who built one of the most thorough property record systems in the Northern Territorial District, who was asked by Clara Hess 2 years later to train the next class of records administrators, and who said yes to that too. She became the woman who went home to Red Willow on weekends when the territory permitted it, who sat at the kitchen table with Caleb and talked through decisions that mattered, whose opinion was factored in, not as a courtesy but as a requirement, who was known on that ranch not as the owner's wife but as the woman who had saved it, which was true, and as the woman who had seen what it was worth before anyone else had, which was also true. She became the woman who taught Margaret Pratt's daughter how to read a land document, who wrote 3 pages of guidelines for rural property owners on identifying document fraud that were distributed by the territorial office across 4 counties, who was recognized, at 47, in a letter from the territorial governor, as having materially changed the landscape of property law in Montana. She kept every one of those things. She did not trade any of them for anything. She also kept the cracked recipe book. It sat on the kitchen shelf at Red Willow, on the same shelf where she'd first set it down when she walked into that sad, broken kitchen, with her chin up and her heart hammering. It was not decorative. She still used it, when she was home, when she cooked for the people she loved. And every time she opened it, she thought about a woman who had been turned away at every door, and had kept walking anyway, not because she was without fear, but because she had always understood, in the deep, unargued way that some truths live in the body rather than the mind, that she was worth the walking. She had been right. She had always been right. And the world slowly, in the way that worlds changed when the right people refused to accept what they were told they were worth, had arrived at the same conclusion.